Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, obviously, I was unable to create content yesterday, but today we are back up and running. And the big headline, obviously, right now is the elimination of Prigozhin. Yevgeny Prigozhin looks to have been taken out by the Russian security service. Now, there is another very important aspect to what happened when that plane was either taken down with an air defense system or another aircraft or a bomb on board. Who knows? But you have to look at the organizational structure of Wagner. Now, most people believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin is the head of Wagner. And in certain ways, he is. And in certain ways, he is not. And I'm going to start from the bottom up, and eventually we're going to get to Prigozhin. But the top leaders of Wagner are Russian colonels, Russian military colonels. The first is Mikhail Mitsiev. I'm probably saying that wrong. The next one is Andrei Troshev. And then there is Konstantin Pikolov. And very important is this individual by the name of Dmitry Utkin. Now, I've talked about him in the past. And then finally you have Yevgeny Prigozhin. The real leader of Wagner, the mind behind the original training curriculum, the deployment of military forces, the person who had the base knowledge to create a high-functioning, elite, special operations, private military contract force was Dmitry Utkin. That was the brains behind Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin had the contacts in the Kremlin. He was at one point close to Vladimir Putin. But the real brains was Dmitry Utkin. That was the commander of Wagner. The military commander of Wagner was Dmitry Utkin. Now, when the Wagner rebellion occurred, we believe that an individual inside of Wagner tipped off Vladimir Putin and the Russian security services. He let the Kremlin know, hey guys, Wagner's getting ready to move against you. And who was that? Well, that individual was Andrei Troshev, another Russian colonel. That individual, right upon the onset of the Wagner rebellion, was terminated, was fired by Wagner. Because even Wagner, the higher echelons, meaning Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, believed that their operation was tipped off by the individual, the colonel, Andrei Troshev. Now, we don't know that for certain, but we think that is what happened. We also believe that the Kremlin, the Russian security forces, eventually wanted Andrei Troshev to take over the Wagner organization. Now, what is the most important part of what I'm talking about is the fact that Dmitry Utkin was also killed in that plane. He was aboard that aircraft when it went down. They got two birds with one stone. and they got the most important guy, meaning they, the Russian security services, those loyal to Vladimir Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov. Obviously, no love loss with those two individuals to Prigozhin. But they were able to kill Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin while they were on board the same airplane. There's Mr. Utkin. If you look at the funeral that took place, you see his picture next to Prigozhin. He was killed. It's very, very interesting, and it means that Utkin was behind what happened during the Wagner rebellion as they tried to move north. And in all likelihood, we'll see some cleaning up inside of the Russian military in terms of the Kremlin going after possible supporters of the Wagner rebellion. What I believe should have happened, that the objective of Dmitry Utkin and Prigozhin was to get the support of certain high-ranking military leaders within the Russian military. I think this was probably going to be much bigger than what happened. I think they were hoping that they were going to get the support of other factions inside the Russian military. They got some tacit support, but ultimately, once the Kremlin became aware of what was happening, those individuals that may have supported Wagner in a full-on coup d'etat backed down. They went to ground. They chose not to participate. And ultimately, they left Yevgeny Prigozhin holding the bag. That was the guy who met with the leaders of the southern Russian military district and ultimately has the face of Wagner, but he does not lead Wagner. This is the guy that was running the Wagner show, Dmitry Utkin. And again, it's very interesting to see that he was also killed on this plane, which really completely, unequivocally removes the possibility that this was some sort of a technical malfunction on that aircraft. Because they got both of them, and they wanted to do that. So very interesting to see what happened with that, and how that's going to further play out in terms of Wagner. In all likelihood, we will probably see this Andrei Troshev possibly regain power of Wagner, or Wagner will just be completely eliminated and absorbed into the Russian military. Hard to say what's going to happen at this point, but that is kind of the backstory in the political intrigue of Wagner and its issues with the Kremlin. Now we are continuing to see, obviously, military engagements taking place within the context of the overall war. We are starting to see some fairly, I would call them desperate measures by the Ukrainian military. Why are they desperate measures? Well, we are seeing the Ukrainians land special operations forces in the Crimea. Over the last 24, 48 hours, we observed a special forces detachment of the Ukrainian military, probably Ukrainian reconnaissance Marines, land in the Crimea and then attempt to raise the Ukrainian flag on a building at night in the Crimean Peninsula. Now, what good is that going to do? What military goal and objective does that serve to send a unit, a small, maybe a dozen personnel, into the Crimea to raise the Ukrainian flag? It doesn't do anything. But it creates a narrative. It creates a narrative. And that narrative in Western media is, oh, look, Ukrainian troops have landed in the Crimea and have raised the Ukrainian flag. The low information voter in the United States and Western Europe then immediately think, oh, look, the Ukrainians are beating the Russians. They've landed in the Crimea. Wow, okay. This $100 billion that have been handed over to the Ukrainians seems to be working. Great, let's keep doing it. And that's the rationale. Now, is that what's happening on the ground? Is it working? Is it causing the Russians military problems to have these small 7-man boats land troops in the Crimea and then skedaddle away? No, it's not. But it creates a false narrative that the Ukrainians are probably having more success than what's actually happening on the ground. We've also seen the Ukrainians launch waves of drones and modified air defense missiles at targets both in Crimea and in the direction of Moscow as well. And this is escalating the conflict because the Russians are going to start to respond. Is there any military objective that sending these drones into the Crimea, into Russia proper, is it going to help the Ukrainians win the war? No, it's not. It may change some perceptions in Russia proper, in the Crimea, which is also Russia proper now. But ultimately, it's not going to help the Ukrainians win the war. It's not. And in compounding that, we are continuing to see the Russians gain strength. It's now being reported that the Russians have increased their monthly recruitment of military personnel up to 22 to 25,000 military personnel being recruited per month into the Russian military. So the Russian military is continuing to rapidly grow. And there is some discussion we could see even a greater wave of Russian mobilization take place, up to 400,000 additional Russian men being recruited, drafted, conscripted into the Russian military. So you have two things happening in Russia. Obviously, you have the military-industrial complex increasing, the increased production of Russian weapons of war, but you also see the expanding Russian ground forces occurring. Not just conscripts, but an effort to obtain volunteers to fight and join the Russian military. So I think at this point, the Russian goal is to continue to gain strength and drag this conflict out as its military continues to get stronger and stronger and stronger, and then ultimately has the ability to just completely crush the Ukrainian military, while at the same time it is draining the Ukrainian military with airstrikes, drone strikes, fixed-wing aircraft operations, using its air force to bombard the Ukrainian military. And that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing, again, we continue to see the Ukrainians attempt offensive operations really in two places along the Zaporizhzhia front in the south here. One is just south of Orikhiv. The Ukrainians are claiming that they've have taken this village right here. And it is a village, a couple dozen houses. But they've created themselves a salient where they are being pummeled by Russian artillery and fixed-wing assets. At the end of the day, it may be putting the Ukrainian forces that are operating in the salient at a greater risk. And then finally, over here to the east, just south of, within the confines of Staromayorsky and Uruzhan, we continue to see Ukrainian forces just getting battered in this area as well. And they are taking a beating from fixed-wing aircraft. The Russians are starting to use more and more glide bombs that are guided with GLONASS, the Russian satellite navigation system, their version of GPS. And they're just continuing to beat the hell out of Ukrainian forces in the south here. And again, remember, the Russian military is continuing to expand. And it looks like that the Russians could be preparing to draw this out for a multi-year conflict. Now, the question is what is the Russian military going to look like a year from now? How big is it going to get? And do we see suddenly a general collapse of the Ukrainian frontal defensive lines where the Russians just roll over these areas just from sheer mass? I mean, the capability that the Russian Federation could marshal 2 million, 3 million personnel is not outside the realm of possibility. I would say at this point it's highly probable that we do see a 2 million man Russian armed forces at some point, especially as the fighting continues and the current growth rate of the Russian military. They've not hit the total war button. They've not gone to a command economy and just completely massive mobilization. That hasn't happened yet. But it's definitely a high tempo, very robust mobilization that is occurring, that is going to dramatically increase the end strength of the Russian military. And look, we know how fickle the West can be. Look at Afghanistan. This ultimate commitment. I mean, imagine going into year 1, 2, 3, 4 in Afghanistan and saying ultimately, oh, the U.S. is going to withdraw and the Taliban are going to take over again. Everyone would say, no, that's not going to happen. That's not possible. Just like men cannot become women and women cannot become men, right? Yeah, right. But that's what's going to happen. The Russians are not going anywhere. The Russians have more to lose in Ukraine than the West has to lose. And you're going to see this narrative change. At a certain point, this narrative, this supporting narrative for the Ukrainians is going to change. And then what happens? Ultimately, a collapse of the state, of the Ukrainian state, and the Russians will move in. And given what's happened in terms of the support that the West has given the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government that is now operating in Kiev, the Russians may go all the way at a certain point, if they have the capability to do that. If they expand their armed forces to a point where they believe they could just overrun a shattered Ukrainian military, they're going to do it now. I think we've hit a point of no return in the brutality of this conflict. And I think the Russian leadership sees an entity in Ukraine that it can no longer tolerate. And now the question is it just a matter of time? You tell me. So that's our coverage for today. We will continue to watch things very closely on the ground. Thanks for joining us. More to come. And as always, have a good day.